The lights went out. Dean Martin froze. He lowered the microphone. And in the darkness, he said one sentence that stopped every heart in the Copa Room. The Sands Hotel. Las Vegas. March 1964. The Copa Room was packed. 400 people in evening wear, cigars glowing like fireflies in the dim lounge light, martini glasses sweating on white tablecloths. Dean Martin was 3 songs into his 11 o'clock set, The Late Show, the one where high rollers came after the tables closed and movie stars slipped in through the kitchen entrance. The orchestra was swinging. Dean had just finished the second verse of Everybody Loves Somebody, when it happened. A sound. Not loud. Just a click. Then darkness. Every stage light went dead. The spots, the floods, the footlights, all of them extinguished in the same instant. The orchestra kept playing for exactly 2.5 bars before the conductor's baton froze mid-air and the music died. 400 people sat in sudden blackness, broken only by the scattered glow of table candles and the red exit signs at the back of the room. Dean Martin stood alone at the microphone, invisible to most of the room, a silhouette against the faint emergency lighting from the wings. He didn't move. Didn't speak. For 4 full seconds, an eternity in live performance. He simply stood there. The room held its breath. Then Dean lowered the microphone slightly. His voice came through the speakers, quiet but absolutely clear, cutting through the darkness with that signature calm. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we're having a small electrical situation. But don't worry, I've performed in darker rooms than this. A nervous laugh rippled through the audience. In fact, Dean continued, his voice carrying that slight ironic edge, some of my best work has been done with the lights off. Bigger laugh now. The tension broke slightly. People shifted in their seats, cigarette lighters flicked on, casting tiny pools of orange light across faces. But Dean wasn't smiling. Not yet. Because he'd seen something the audience hadn't noticed. In the front row, third table from the left, a man had stood up the moment the lights went out. Not in confusion. Not in concern. In purpose. And Dean recognized him immediately. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room understood anyway. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who was in that room. And more specifically, who was sitting at table 3. The Copa Room at the Sands wasn't just a nightclub. It was neutral territory. A place where certain men who couldn't be seen together in daylight could sit in adjacent booths and conduct business over bourbon while Dean crooned about love and loneliness. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone played along. Frank Sinatra owned part of the Sands. Jack and Trader ran the Copa Room. And certain other gentlemen, let's call them investors, maintained a quiet but unmistakable presence. Table 3, front row, always went to the same party when they were in town. Tonight it was occupied by 3 men in dark suits. The one in the middle was Vincent Marcello, a businessman from Chicago with interests in vending machines, unions, and places where dice landed in favorable patterns. Dean had known Vincent since the early 50s. They weren't friends. Dean didn't have friends in that world, not really, but they had an understanding. Vincent loved the shows. Dean never asked questions. Everyone was happy. But tonight, Vincent had brought someone with him. A younger man, maybe 30, sitting to his left. Crew cut. Dead eyes. The kind of face you forgot on purpose. Dean had noticed him during the first song. More specifically, he noticed the way Vincent kept leaning over to whisper to him, and the way the young man kept checking his watch, and the way both of them kept glancing toward the wings, toward the backstage entrance, toward the place where Dean's dressing room was located. Dean Martin had spent 15 years in Vegas. He'd learned to read rooms the way card counters read shoes. And he'd learned that when certain men kept checking their watches and glancing at exits, it meant something bad was about to happen to someone. The lights going out wasn't an electrical problem. It was cover. Dean stood at the microphone in the darkness, listening to the scattered nervous laughter from the audience, watching the glow of cigarettes bob and weave as people shifted in their seats. He couldn't see Vincent's table clearly now, just the faint outline of bodies, the brief flash of a lighter. But he'd seen enough. The stage manager's voice crackled in the monitor speaker built into the floor. "Dean, we've got a situation with the main breaker. Give us 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Plenty of time for someone to slip backstage unseen. Plenty of time for a door to open and close. Plenty of time for Dean's assistant, Charlie Morrison, to be alone in that dressing room, counting the night's cash from the private parties Dean did after hours. Charlie. 62 years old. Heart condition. Korean War vet who'd saved Dean's life once in a different kind of darkness when a drunk patron had pulled a knife in a Detroit club in 1951. Charlie, who Dean trusted with everything and who certain people might want to send a message through. Dean made a decision. He stepped away from the microphone. Not far, just 1 step back, enough to create distance. Then he spoke again, but differently now. Quieter. More personal. The voice he used when the cameras weren't rolling. "Folks, I need to step away for just a moment. But I'm going to ask my very good friend in the orchestra to play something beautiful while I'm gone. Something with strings. Something that sounds expensive." The conductor, barely visible in the glow from his music stand light, raised his baton. The orchestra began a slow, lush arrangement of "When You're Smiling," instrumental only, giving Dean coverage. Dean handed the microphone to a stagehand and walked toward the wings. Not rushed. Not panicked. Just a man excusing himself during a technical difficulty. But instead of going to his dressing room, Dean turned left at the wings and walked down the narrow side passage that ran along the front of the stage, the one that led directly to the house floor, to the tables, to the audience. He emerged from the darkness into the faint candlelight of the Copa Room floor. People near the aisle saw him first, gasps, whispers spreading like ripples. Dean Martin walking through the audience. Dean Martin approaching table 3. Vincent Marcello saw him coming. The businessman's face registered surprise, then something harder to read. The young man beside him started to stand. Dean reached the table. He didn't sit. He stood beside Vincent's chair, hands in his pockets, and spoke in a voice just loud enough for the 3 men at the table to hear. "Vincent. Good to see you. Enjoying the show?" "Dean. Yeah, great set. Shame about the lights." "Shame," Dean agreed. He looked at the young man, who was now half standing, uncertain. "I don't believe we've met. This is my nephew," Vincent said quickly. "Tony. From Chicago. First time in Vegas. Welcome to Vegas, Tony." Dean's voice was pleasant. Friendly even. But his eyes held something else. "You picked an interesting night to visit. Power outages. Very dramatic." "Yeah," Tony said. His hand had moved toward his jacket. Just slightly. Just enough. Dean noticed. Of course he noticed. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dean shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself between Tony and the backstage entrance. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Vincent did. "Dean," Vincent said carefully, "is there something we can help you with?" "Actually, yes." Dean pulled one hand from his pocket. He was holding a lighter, a simple silver Zippo, the kind every man in Vegas carried. He flicked it open, creating a small flame that illuminated the 3 faces at the table. "I seem to have lost my cigarette case. Left it in my dressing room. I was going to send someone back to get it, but then I thought, why not go myself? Stretch my legs. Say hello to old friends." He paused, letting the flame dance between them. "The thing is, Vincent, my assistant Charlie is back there. Counting receipts. Gets nervous when people walk in unexpected. Heart condition, you know. Doctor says surprises aren't good for him." Vincent's face didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted. "So I thought," Dean continued, his voice still pleasant, still calm, "that while the lights are out, While everyone's a little confused, while young Tony here is wondering what to do with his evening, I thought maybe I'd just stand right here. Keep you company. Make sure nobody wanders backstage who shouldn't be there. Just until the lights come back on." The lighter flame reflected in Tony's eyes. His hand was still near his jacket. Vincent's hand moved to Tony's arm, fingers tightening. "Of course," Vincent said slowly. "That makes sense. Tony was just getting some air anyway. Weren't you, Tony?" Tony looked at Vincent. Something passed between uncle and nephew, a conversation in glances. Then Tony stood fully, straightened his jacket, and nodded at Dean. "Nice meeting you, Mr. Martin." "Likewise." Tony walked toward the front entrance, not the backstage exit. Dean watched him go, counted to 5, then snapped the lighter closed. The lights came back on. All at once, flooding the room with brightness. The audience burst into applause, relieved, celebratory applause for something as simple as electricity returning. The orchestra swelled, picking up the melody with renewed energy. Dean looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at Dean. "Thanks for understanding," Dean said quietly. "No problem," Vincent replied. "Enjoy the rest of your show." Dean walked back to the stage. The audience thought he'd been checking on the technical problem. The orchestra thought he'd been talking to a friend. Only Vincent and Tony knew what had actually happened in those 2 minutes of darkness. Dean took the microphone from the stagehand, stepped back into the spotlight, and smiled that easy smile. "Well," he said to the audience, "that was exciting. Where were we?" He launched into the next song without missing a beat. The show continued as if nothing had happened. Because in Dean Martin's world, that's how you handled things, quietly, efficiently, without drama. Off camera, Dean made a choice no producer expected. After the show, Dean went straight to his dressing room. Charlie was there, safe, surrounded by stacks of cash and receipts, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. "Hey boss," Charlie said, looking up from his ledger. "Hell of a show tonight. What was with the lights?" "Breaker blew," Dean said. "All fixed now." He didn't mention Vincent. Didn't mention Tony. Didn't mention the moment at table 3. Because that's not how Dean operated. You didn't brag about preventing disasters. You just prevented them. But word travels fast in Vegas. By morning, every pit boss and car dealer and stage manager at the Sands had heard some version of the story. Dean Martin had faced down a problem in the darkness. Dean Martin had stood his ground without raising his voice. Within a week, Vincent Marcello sent a case of Dean's favorite bourbon to the dressing room. No note. No explanation. Just the bottles, expensive and silent. Charlie opened one that night after the show. "What's the occasion?" Dean poured 2 glasses. "No occasion. Just a man saying thank you." "For what?" Dean raised his glass. "For me keeping the lights on." They drank in silence. But what happened next was the part nobody, not even the band, was prepared to witness. 3 months later, Dean was back at the Copa Room. Different night, different crowd, same stage. He was midway through. That's amore. When he saw Vincent Marcello walk in, alone this time, no nephew, just the older man in his familiar dark suit. Vincent took table 3. Ordered his usual bourbon. Watched the show with that inscrutable expression. After the set, Vincent came backstage. It was the first time in all their years of knowing each other that he'd ever done that. "Dean," Vincent said, standing in the dressing room doorway. "Vincent, I wanted to tell you something. That night with the lights. Tony, my nephew. He wasn't there for your assistant." Dean said nothing. Just waited. "He was there for me," Vincent continued. "There were people who thought I was getting too comfortable here. Too visible. They wanted to remind me that accidents happen in the dark. You standing there, at my table, in front of 400 witnesses, that changed their calculation." "I didn't know that," Dean said. "I know you didn't. That's why it worked. Vincent reached into his jacket. Dean didn't flinch. Vincent pulled out a simple silver cigarette case, engraved, expensive, worn smooth by years of handling. This was my brother's. He died in '52. You reminded me of him that night. Stayed cool when everyone else was panicking. He placed the case on Dean's dressing table. I wanted you to have it. Not as payment. As respect. From one professional to another. Dean looked at the case, then at Vincent. He understood. In their world, this meant something more than gratitude. Thank you, Dean said simply. Vincent nodded once and left without another word. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dean kept that cigarette case for the rest of his life. Never used it on stage. Never showed it to reporters. But Charlie knew what it meant. The bandleader knew. Jack and Trader knew. It meant Dean Martin had stood in darkness and didn't blink. He'd protected his own with nothing but presence and timing. No guns, no threats, no raised voices. Just one man refusing to let bad things happen on his watch. Years later, when young comedians asked Dean how he stayed so cool under pressure, he'd just smile that easy smile and say, "Kid, when you've performed in the dark, everything else is just lighting." The cigarette case sat in his dressing room drawer, silent and silver, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand your ground and wait for the lights to come back on.